So I'm going to be presenting on using creative methods to explore the primary to secondary school transition experience for neurodivergent pupils. I'm an autistic researcher at York St John University. I was also recently diagnosed with ADHD, but that's much more recent. I'm doing my PhD in primary to secondary school transitions, supervised by Lorna Hamilton and Jonathan Vincent. So the plan for this talk, I'll briefly give an overview of the research project as a whole, just so you've got some context. But the main thing I'm going to focus on tonight is the creative research methods, so the data collection part of the research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some reflections on those research methods and conducting creative research in general. Briefly touch on some data analysis bits and a little bit of data, but I've not done the data analysis formally yet. And then I'm going to just quickly at the end talk about some animations that we've co-produced with the young people taking part in this research. So as I said, the team is made up of myself and then Lorna Hamilton and Jonathan Vincent. We're also supported, we're funded by the Sir Halley Stewart Trust, and we're supported by Matthew Reason at the ISJ at York St John, the City of York Council, and we have an advisory panel as well. So the objectives of the research as a whole are to firstly to use participatory creative methods to meaningfully include and promote the voices of autistic and neurodivergent pupils in schools research. To collect data from primarily from the pupils, but also some from parents or families at multiple time points throughout the school transition process, to understand those individual experiences of the school transition in York. And then the third objective is to produce some materials in a participatory way that could be used to inform other children or their families or schools and professionals about the primary school to secondary school transitions and what might be able to help facilitate that. So just to contextualise it, so why is it important? SEN pupils make up 17.3% approximately of the total UK school age population, so it's a big proportion of pupils in schools who have additional needs, and neurodivergent pupils account for a big proportion of that number, according to the Department for Education. A lot of those pupils are in mainstream education, so for autistic pupils, for example, 73% of autistic pupils are enrolled in mainstream education. So education for neurodivergent pupils is a really important area to look at. And in particular, the transition from primary to secondary school can be a challenging experience, obviously, for many pupils. Sometimes it can be a positive experience, sometimes it can be a challenging experience, but particularly for neurodivergent pupils, there's evidence that they might be particularly vulnerable to that change and that transition. And that's because there's a lot of changes associated with it. So things like changes in peers, changes in teachers and school staff, lots more executive demands. So things like remembering homework and knowing which lessons to go throughout the day and things like that. So there's lots of executive function demands. And the school day structure changes completely. So rather than being in one lesson, one classroom, which most pupils are in primary school, you have to move around the class to different lessons and different teachers. Unfortunately, there's been shown to be higher rates of peer victimisation and school exclusion for neurodivergent pupils, and also poorer mental health outcomes like anxiety and depression. So it's important, obviously, to then understand what that experience is like and what the barriers might be to that experience, and also what might help facilitate that transition. And to do that, it's really important to listen to first-hand experiences of neurodivergent pupils. And one way to do that can be really effective is using creative research methods, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So just to show you the timeline of data collection, so you can see the slightly more faded colours is data that I've collected already, and then the darker colours towards the right-hand side are data that I'm yet to collect, so it's still ongoing. And this is meeting with pupils and parents in year 6, 7 and 8. So I'm seeing the transition as being quite a long process. Some research looks specifically at the point of transition, so for example in September, but I'm aware that those changes can take longer to take effect and the implications might not be known until later. So that's why I'm trying to look at the longest period that I'm able to look at. So the orange is meetings with parents and the purple is meetings with students. We had pre-study meetings with parents and students, and then data collection sessions at the end of year 6 with the pupils, and midway through year 7, midway through year 8 and at the end of year 8, and then some supplementary interviews with parents as well. The participants, 13 neurodivergent children in mainstream schools in York, so all moving from mainstream primary to mainstream secondary schools. At the time of recruitment, they all were either diagnosed autistic or were awaiting assessment. And 6 specifically have diagnosed co-occurring needs. So that includes things like ADHD, Tourette syndrome, cerebral palsy, and situational mutism. There's also a young person where English is his second language, a young person who's a young carer. So we're looking at kind of a spectrum of need, I suppose. And they all have, obviously, being very different, 13 very different children, they have a range of communication and wider skill profiles. We have 3 girls and 10 boys. Obviously would have loved to have more girls, just because girls tend to be diagnosed later. That's probably the primary reason we struggled to recruit. We really tried to recruit more girls, but that was the maximum amount we were able to get to at the time of study starting. And all of our participants are white British or white European. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the creative methods that we've used throughout this research and that I've used in the schools. And this is based on a paper that myself, Lorna and Jonathan recently had published on reflections on that creative research method approach. So I mentioned a pre-study phase. We used that phase before gathering any data as an opportunity to explain the research project, to make sure that we had provisional consent from parents and assent from the children. And to do that, we provided an easy read outline of the study with some examples of questions that they might be asked, things that we might discuss, photos and descriptions of research team members, just to reduce any uncertainty before starting the research. A member of the research team then had a brief phone call with a parent or carer of each child, and that was to gather some initial information about communication preferences and interests, so things that we might be able to talk about in that first meeting, and some indicators of the kind of things that might show us that their child is engaged in the research or that the research is actually causing their child some stress and that we need to either stop or take a break and things like that. So after that conversation, we had a familiarisation meeting with the children. And in that session, we completed some activities alongside each other. And that included things, depending on those interests again, but things like discussing those interests, drawing, writing. And this is an example of an About Me sheet that I completed alongside one of the children. We also obtained assent in that session by asking the children to circle either thumbs up or thumbs down in response to a series of questions just to assess understanding and that they were happy to be involved. And again, that stage enabled us to build profiles for each child of specifically what their needs are, what their interests might be, and the kind of things we need to consider throughout the research. And those were used to inform the future data collection sessions. So the main aim with going into schools and doing this research was to offer multiple means of engagement with the research. So to apply this kind of universal design to research. And to do that, I had lots of different options that pupils could choose to do. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later, but I'll just talk briefly about the methods that we did offer. So first of all, these kind of sorting tasks. So a card sort where we provided participants with a set of images with descriptions in each image, and we asked them to rate those from 1 to 5 stars according to how much they liked them. So the options there, we did the school subjects, and we also did other aspects of the school day. So things like finding their way around the school, doing the homework, the teachers, things like that. And we did that with most of the young people in the study because actually it was a really effective way to then structure the rest of the session and to provide the children with a way to know what was coming, know what we might discuss, and also to choose not to discuss things. So, for example, they could take things off the sheet and put them to one side if they actually didn't want to talk about those. Similarly, we offered a statement sort exercise. So in this exercise, participants had a series of statements and they sorted those into yes, no, or not sure categories. And those sentences were things like, I feel happy at school, I feel different to other children at school, I enjoy break times at school. So there's a range of kind of positive and negative statements. And again, for children who prefer to engage with words, that was quite an effective way to start scaffold the conversation. And then we also have these drawing or embodied based data collection methods. So firstly, draw, write, tell. So in this exercise, we gave children a series of prompts, quite general prompts like draw something that you enjoy at school, draw something that you find challenging at school. And they were given time to draw or write their answers before we discussed them together. And through that, we were kind of able to pick out the meaning of the drawing and co-create that meaning rather than going away and looking at the pictures ourselves and kind of attributing meaning to them. Then there's also a comic book creation task. So for this, I provided the participants with a blank template of a comic book with kind of spaces to draw and spaces to write. And they were asked to draw or write about a typical school day or to kind of assimilate different lessons that they either really enjoyed or didn't enjoy, and things like lunchtime and break times as well. And then finally, in this section, we offered body mapping. So participants were provided with an outline of a body and then asked to draw kind of how different parts of the school day felt in their body or the different things they might feel at school. So you can't see very well here, it's quite small, but for this participant, for example, some of the things were very physical things. So he's drawn like colours on his shoulders to show that carrying his school bag around gives him a quite shoulder strain. But then he's also talked about more emotional aspects. So he's put like time in his tummy because the lessons always seem to take too long, but then lunchtime doesn't feel long enough and things like that. So it kind of draws out those topics. And then finally, some more movement-based exercises. So a walk and talk. So in this one, participants took the researcher around their classroom or around the school and showed them aspects of the environment that were particularly relevant to them. And some participants also chose to take photos of significant places or items. I put photo elicitation because for some pupils as well, I took photos in of their secondary school to prompt that conversation. That method we used in year 6 in primary school. We actually didn't use it in secondary school. That's primarily because of access reasons. So going into a bigger secondary school with less relationships built with the teachers, we weren't able to walk around those schools for obvious reasons, unfortunately. And also for some participants, actually that task was too unstructured almost. So some participants took us around places in the school that they'd never seen before and they just fancied seeing. So it was kind of balancing what's enjoyable and what's interesting for the young people, but also what is going to elicit some data that's meaningful. So as a kind of counter to that, in year 7 and 8, I'm offering this emotion selection task. So participants can either choose emojis that they're obviously very familiar with, or select emotion words that are spread around the room. So they can still move around the room between things, but we're kind of a bit more contained, which fulfills those school requirements as well. So the main thing really in offering all those methods is that it offers that choice. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of some reflections on using those methods and some learning going forwards. So the first thing I think is really, really important to say is that creative methods in and of themselves aren't this kind of be all and end all magic pill to research. Actually, they're more of a vehicle to be able to build relationships, to be able to be flexible in research, to respond to those individual needs. So firstly, relationship building. So obviously the pre-data meetings were helpful in doing that. We also had lots of times in sessions where we went very off track, I suppose, and talked for a long time about particular interests or things that had happened in the school day and things like that. And following those kind of stray thoughts actually was really helpful in building those relationships and then knowing obviously when to come back to the research. That also helped, and this kind of links the reflexivity. Going into school, obviously, as an adult, I'm already kind of in a position of authority in some way. So obviously, I'm not a teacher and I'm going in as an external person, but these young people are used in school to responding to authority and to being respectful and things like that. So it was important to develop those relationships, to show interest in those interests and things like that as well, just to help to balance that power. And things like the card sort helped with that as well. The other thing was being flexible. So obviously I have all these choices. For some participants, having all of those choices was great and they were able to look at all those choices and then pick something they liked. For some of the children, and I think I would be included in this, looking at all these different options was actually very overwhelming. So between sessions, I kind of learned to select a few different ones that might be the most relevant to this young person, and then to offer maybe 2 or 3 choices to some children and to offer maybe 6 to others. So it's really about that responding to the individual need and offering options accordingly. Reflexivity. So one of the things that was continual throughout the process was this kind of reflection in action process. So for example, with the assent, we obtained assent formally at the start of the research, but assent was also a continual process. And that was both kind of obvious assent. So at the start of each session, I would ask again all of the series of questions, and the children would point to yes or no, or would say yes or no in response to those. But also throughout the session, I would be kind of mindful of cues that might indicate that the person I'm working with actually is getting a bit bored or a bit frustrated, or that I've asked something that feels a bit too emotional to talk about. So as a researcher, it's kind of my responsibility to be aware of that and to offer breaks or to offer to end the session as well. Something that I think is a good example of reflexivity is in the initial sessions, I would obviously say at the start, you can choose whether to participate or not. You can choose to have a break at any time. You can choose to stop at any time. And then wouldn't mention it again. And none of the participants asked to stop. But then obviously with being aware of my power position in the research, in future sessions, I offered these cards. So participants could verbally still ask to take a break, but they could also use these cards to show that they wanted to have a break or that they wanted to end the session. Something else that played into that was actually I was working with one of the children and I said, you can choose to stop the session at any time. And they said, oh, but then will I have to go back to lessons? And I hadn't considered that, but actually it was a really good point that if I was offering the choice between either you can do my research or you can go back to that lesson that maybe you're not enjoying, that's not really offering a choice in the same way. So from then on, I kind of made it clear that they could stop doing the research, but still stay in the room and do a different activity, and we could do activities separately and things like that. So just offering all those different choices. All of those things together, I think alongside the creative methods, helped to really elicit some really rich data. So thinking about data analysis, for this project specifically, the items from the data collection, such as the drawings, the comics, the card sorts, and the photos, aren't intended to be analysed as separate research outputs, but instead they were kind of used to scaffold the conversation, to help to balance that power that I mentioned, and to generate and to help order those conversation topics. So the discussions around them and the kind of semi-structured interviews that followed them were the part that's actually being transcribed and being analysed. And also, as I said, the discussions were used to inform future topics in future sessions. So between each session, we would build on the individual research protocol. So as I said, I've not analysed any data yet, but I've just got some examples of conversations that arose through using these creative methods. So this is one. So I've said, why have you chosen her as your favourite teacher, do you think? Yeah, well, most of my previous teachers just kind of thought I was just naughty because they didn't really know about ADHD. Excellent. And Miss knows that you're not naughty. Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? So if you do something in class which other teachers might think were naughty, like, I don't know, you know better than me, but if you were fidgeting a lot, for example, what would Miss do that was different to other teachers? She doesn't really do anything to stop you from fidgeting because I've got like a blue tack. You've got your blue tack to help, yeah. So she just lets you use the things that help you, yeah. And then, so that's in year 6. And this young person was talking about year 7 and really hoping that the teachers would have that same kind of understanding around additional needs and around the kind of adjustments that might help that they could just do quietly throughout the day. Unfortunately, they didn't quite have that experience. So this is from year 7. And again, I've said, do you think that your teachers understand what autism is or not? I think some of them do. What makes you think that some of them do and some of them don't? For science, I got a behaviour of 3 because I'm not constantly volunteering answers. Okay. So you don't really like to speak up and you like being quiet in class. And like my PE teacher was told at the parents' evening thing, and it didn't really sound like he knew what it was. Okay, so your PE teacher maybe doesn't know much about autism or doesn't know how to support people. And I've heard that some of the other people at the school using it as an insult, like saying this person is so autistic and stuff like that. How does that make you feel when you hear that? angry. So firstly, this kind of shows that that change in terms of how the teachers are responding in secondary school compared to primary school. I think it also illustrates with this participant how that relationship between me and the participant has developed, because in this second interview in year 7, they're a lot more comfortable talking about all these different things, and actually they're bringing up a lot of these topics themselves very quickly. And then just because those were, that was quite negative examples of some secondary school teaching, I've got a positive example. So this is a young person in year 7 who said, our teachers are really, really nice and they help me whenever it's difficult. And if the majority of the class don't understand it, the teachers go through it again and again and again until we all understand. And this was when completing the comic book drawing exercise. And they've done this really lovely illustration of a PE lesson. And there's the teacher there who's explaining to them what's going to happen in the lesson, and who's letting them know in advance to reduce that uncertainty. And then on the right hand side is some of the things during the lesson that they enjoy about PE, or that the teacher does that helps them. So they've talked about how they're able to ask questions throughout the lesson, and they talked about how asking those questions is fine. It's not seen as like being troublesome or asking too many questions. They've talked about how they have lots of support through the lesson. And then they've also talked about how they're given times out when they want them. And that's kind of a positive kind of timeout, not like a negative kind of timeout. So that's just some examples of the data that's come from this research. But like I said, it's not been analysed yet. Provisional thinking about data analysis, and if anyone kind of is familiar with these kinds of data analysis or has any ideas or experience, I'd really like to hear it, because I am right at the start of considering the analysis part of my research. But what I'm planning to do is firstly analyse each data collection session individually using some kind of thematic analysis like IPA. Then I'm planning to do case studies for either for all the participants or for a subset of participants, depending on obviously time. And those will be to follow the individual narratives throughout the school transition process. So things that happened in year 7 and year 8 and year 7, 6, 7 and 8, sorry, and how those things have changed. And I've not really mentioned the parent interviews, but some information, supplementary information from parent interviews could feed into that. And then obviously the main aim of my research is not to create kind of generalizable outcomes, but more to understand individual experiences. But I am planning to do some kind of cross-case analysis to build a picture of if there are common facilitators and common challenges to transition success. So that's the data analysis very, very briefly. Like I said, I'll just touch quickly on another part of the project, which Jonathan's led on, but I have been involved with, and that's co-producing some animations. Excuse my very crude way that I've anonymised all of the students in this room, but this is an animation day that we had with Jason, who is our lovely animator. And in this session, we went through some of the things that different children had said about school, and we talked about which ones were the most important to people and which ones were the most relevant, which ones they wanted to have in the videos. We also talked about how they might be represented in the videos, and these kids have way more amazing creative ideas than I do, so that was fantastic. And then Jason also provided us with these lovely sheets, so we could have a think about things like what colour palettes we wanted to use, kind of character styles and patterns and colours and things like that as well. So we've created 3 animations out of this research. The first is on how participants are feeling about the transition to secondary school. The second is on what year 7 is like. And the third is on what helps with transition. And if we've got time, I might send a link out to one of those so everyone can watch it. So thank you very much for listening, and also a massive thank you obviously to all the pupils that took part in this research and their families and schools, and to the Sir Tally Stewart Trust and the Institute for Social Justice. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.